I still remember the night it all came crashing down, like it was carved into my bones. I'd been out late, work running overtime, only to come home to an eerie silence in the house. Normally, Marie would leave the lights on, or at least leave a little something out to welcome me back. Not that night. I thought maybe she'd fallen asleep early. She had seemed distant lately, blaming exhaustion, stress, and every excuse in the book for her coldness. But as I walked through the door, a strange feeling crept over me, prickling at the back of my neck. I shrugged it off, kicking off my shoes and heading upstairs. I noticed a faint, odd sound coming from the direction of the basement. My first thought was that the neighbor's cat, who sometimes wandered into our yard, might have somehow ended up in there. But as I got closer to the door, the sounds grew louder. They weren't sounds of an animal. No. They were unmistakable whispers and laughter, Marie's laughter, though not the laugh I was used to. It was something darker, layered with mockery. I opened the basement door, taking the steps down, every part of me bracing for what I might find. And there she was, Marie, standing in the middle of the basement with our neighbor, Mark. They were whispering in a way that was far too intimate, laughing like they had their own private joke. And when Marie saw me, she didn't jump back in shock or try to explain herself. Instead, she smirked, her face lighting up with a cruelty I'd never seen before. "Dave," she said, smiling like she had some sinister secret. "You're home earlier than I thought. What's going on here, Marie?" I could barely get the words out, my voice already trembling with a blend of anger and confusion. "What's he doing here?" Mark just stood there, smugly silent, his eyes glinting with something vile. It was like they were both in on some twisted game I wasn't supposed to know about. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Marie said, rolling her eyes, as though I'd caught them discussing the weather. "You're always so uptight. You'd think a little fun would lighten you up." "A little fun?" My voice cracked as I tried to comprehend the audacity. "Is that what you're calling this?" She moved closer to me, her smile stretching into something colder, her tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, Dave. Fun. Something you wouldn't understand." I could barely breathe. Anger, betrayal, and humiliation churned in my gut, yet I was still trying to keep my cool. But what she did next shattered any semblance of control I had left. With a laugh, Marie reached into her back pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Before I could even process what was happening, she grabbed my arm, clamping the cuffs around my wrist, and attached me to the cold, rusted radiator. "What the hell are you doing?" I struggled against the handcuffs, feeling the metal bite into my skin. "Let me go, Marie. This isn't funny." She leaned in, her face inches from mine, her breath warm but her eyes devoid of any affection. "Funny is exactly what this is, Dave. Maybe now you'll understand how boring you are. How predictable." And then, as if I didn't even exist, she turned back to Mark, taking his hand with a coy smile, and led him upstairs. I heard them laughing as they went, leaving me cuffed and seething in the basement, helpless to do anything but listen to the faint sounds above. Each second dragged by like hours, the rage growing inside me as their laughter echoed through the walls. The anger mixed with a kind of sorrow that I didn't even recognize. It was like part of me was dying right there in that basement. I thought of all the years we'd spent together, the nights I'd stayed up listening to her vent about her problems, the sacrifices I'd made to make her happy. And here I was, left to rot in the basement while she shared laughs and God knows what else with our neighbor. Eventually, I heard them coming down the stairs, their footsteps slow and unbothered. They stopped in front of me, Mark smirking like he'd just won some prize. Marie leaned down, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Ah, come on, Dave," she cooed, unlocking the handcuffs. "It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." I jerked my hands free the moment the cuffs opened, glaring at both of them. "When I get free, you'll regret the day you were born," I growled, barely holding back the urge to lunge at them both. Marie just laughed, waving her hand dismissively as if my anger was nothing more than a child's tantrum. Sure, Dave. Whatever helps you sleep at night. And with that, they left, leaving me alone in a silence that screamed louder than any words. The rage, the betrayal, it was all boiling over, and yet somehow, it was only the beginning. In that single, excruciating night, I knew I couldn't look at Marie the same way again. And as I sat there, alone in that dark basement, a grim realization crept over me: this wasn't just betrayal. It was a declaration, a mockery of everything we'd built. And I knew I wouldn't rest until I'd made them both understand exactly what they'd unleashed. The basement felt like it was shrinking around me. The stale, damp air mixed with the echoes of Marie's laughter and Mark's smug expression burned into my mind. My wrists were sore from where the cuffs had dug into my skin, leaving angry red marks as the only proof that it hadn't been some twisted nightmare. When I finally climbed up the stairs, the house was empty. The quiet mocked me, filling every corner, every room with a coldness that felt personal, intentional. I could smell her perfume lingering in the air, a sharp reminder of the night's betrayal. It felt like she'd branded her cruelty into our home, like she'd marked her territory and left, laughing all the way. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marie's face, that smug, wicked smile as she'd cuffed me to the radiator. And I kept replaying her words, like she'd cast some kind of spell: "You're always so uptight, Dave. Maybe a little fun would lighten you up." The rage that boiled inside me was almost alive, pressing against my ribs, reminding me of how she'd looked at me like I was the fool in her personal circus. The next day, I called in sick to work. There was no way I could face anyone in that state, but I didn't tell a soul what had happened. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for her to come home. I wanted answers. I wanted her to look me in the eye and explain why she'd thrown away everything we had, our years together, our vows, for some thrill with the neighbor. How long had it been going on? Had I really been so blind? Hours ticked by, every second fueling the anger that had taken root. I rehearsed what I'd say to her, every word sharper than the last. But when the door finally opened and Marie walked in, her face twisted in fake surprise, every ounce of my carefully planned speech went up in smoke. "Oh, you're here?" She barely looked at me, tossing her purse onto the couch. She had that same smug look from the night before, as if she knew exactly what was coming and didn't care. "Of course I'm here, Marie," I said, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "What was that last night? You think humiliating me like that is a joke?" She shrugged, walking into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine like we were discussing the weather. "Dave, honestly, you need to calm down. You're making way too big a deal out of this." "A big deal?" My voice broke, and the bitterness slipped through before I could stop it. "You handcuff me to a radiator while you're upstairs with him, laughing, and you call that a joke? How long have you been doing this, Marie? How long have you been lying to me?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes rolling with practiced exasperation. "Oh, stop acting like some innocent victim here. You're not exactly a saint, Dave. You're boring. Predictable. You've got no ambition, no excitement. Do you know how exhausting it is, pretending like I'm content with this dull little life you've built?" Her words hit like bullets, each one sinking deeper than the last. I stood there, stunned, as she spat out her excuses, her tone laced with venom. She didn't even seem ashamed. No guilt. No remorse. Just irritation, as though my very presence annoyed her. "So that's your excuse?" I managed, voice thick with disbelief. "You cheat on me because you're bored? And you think you have the right to punish me for it?" She laughed, swirling her wine in her glass, her face twisted with that same smirk. "Oh, grow up, Dave. I'm just being honest. You're angry because I told the truth. And maybe, just maybe, you're angry because you know I'm right. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell, to throw something, anything, just to break through that cold, emotionless mask she wore. You can't just throw away years together like that, Marie. We had something real. I loved you. Doesn't that mean anything to you? She shrugged, taking another sip. People grow apart, Dave. It happens. Maybe you should have tried a little harder to keep me interested. Maybe you should have been more than this predictable, safe option. Her words stung like salt in an open wound, and I felt the helplessness wash over me, a tidal wave of realization. This wasn't just some one-time slip, some mistake she regretted. No, she'd planned this, justified it, turned it over in her mind until she was convinced she deserved it. To her, I was nothing but an inconvenience, a means to an end. My voice trembled, barely a whisper. So, what now, Marie? You've had your fun. Is that it? Are we done? She rolled her eyes, sighing dramatically, like my pain was boring her. We'll see. But for now, maybe you should get used to things changing around here. If you don't like it, well, you know where the door is. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on me, filling every corner. She turned away, not sparing me another glance, heading upstairs without a second thought. And I was left standing there, feeling like a stranger in my own home, wondering how the woman I'd once loved had become this unrecognizable, cruel stranger. As I watched her walk away, something hardened inside me, some wall I hadn't known I was capable of building. She'd broken something beyond repair, a part of me that couldn't be put back together. And in that moment, I realized that whatever came next, I wasn't going to play by her rules anymore. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by the memories of what we once were and the harsh reality of what we'd become. And with every passing moment, the fury inside me grew, sharpening into something stronger, something I was no longer willing to bury. Marie had lit a fire inside me, one that couldn't be extinguished. And whether she knew it or not, she'd started a game that I intended to finish. The days that followed were like a twisted dance of silent wars and buried rage. Marie went about her life, parading around the house as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't torn apart everything we'd built. She'd come and go, often returning late with excuses that didn't even attempt to hide the lies beneath them. And every time she looked at me, it was with that same condescending smirk, daring me to do something about it. At first, I tried to hold on to whatever scraps of sanity I could find. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every snide remark, every dismissive glance she'd thrown my way. She was tearing me apart, piece by piece, with a kind of cruelty that went beyond simple betrayal. It was as if she enjoyed watching me suffer, watching me try and fail to hold on to the last threads of my dignity. One night, she came home even later than usual. I was sitting on the couch, waiting, my hands clenched so tight that my knuckles had turned white. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting the seconds as I wrestled with the anger that threatened to consume me. When she finally walked through the door, I could smell the faint hint of someone else's cologne clinging to her, and something inside me snapped. She barely glanced my way, kicking off her shoes and heading straight for the kitchen. "You're late," I said, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended. But I didn't care anymore. The time for pretending was long gone. She paused, casting a sideways glance at me, her eyes glinting with that familiar contempt. "You're still up? Really, Dave, do you have nothing better to do than sit around waiting for me?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep the rage simmering just beneath the surface. "Where were you?" She laughed, shaking her head like I was some petulant child. "Oh, please, don't start with the interrogation routine. You're embarrassing yourself. Where were you?" I repeated, my voice sharper now, each word edged with a determination that even I hadn't known I possessed. She rolled her eyes, tossing her coat onto the chair and reaching for a bottle of wine. Out, she said simply, pouring herself a glass, not even bothering to look at me. Does it really matter? Yes, I said, the weight of that single word heavy with everything I hadn't yet said. It matters, Marie. Because I'm done sitting here, waiting for you to decide when I'm worth your time. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me over the rim of the glass. Is that so? She sneered. So what are you going to do about it, Dave? You've never had the guts to stand up for yourself. That's why I can't even stand to be around you anymore. The words hit like a slap to the face, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt the blood rushing to my head, a storm of emotions that had been building for far too long, and suddenly, it all came spilling out. You know what, Marie? I said, my voice low but trembling with anger. You've done a lot of things, but I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being the one you mock, the one you toss aside whenever it suits you. I don't deserve this. She laughed, a cold, empty sound that only fueled the fire in my chest. Deserve? Oh, Dave, you're a joke. You think I owe you something? You think you've been some kind of perfect husband? She took another sip, her eyes daring me to challenge her. Face it, you were just the easy option, the safe one. And I got bored. Simple as that. Those words, so casually spoken, shattered whatever was left of the man I'd once been. She didn't care. She'd thrown away our life together without a second thought, all because she'd decided that I wasn't exciting enough, wasn't thrilling enough to keep her entertained. I stood there, staring at her, my fists clenched, my heart racing. I don't know who you are anymore, Marie, I whispered, the sadness mingling with my anger, twisting into something dark and bitter. The woman I married would never have done this. She would never have treated someone like this. She shrugged, her face completely unbothered. Maybe I was pretending, Dave. Maybe the woman you thought you loved never existed in the first place. The silence that followed was colder than any winter night. She turned away, dismissing me with a wave of her hand as she headed up the stairs, leaving me alone in the dimly lit living room, the wine glass she'd left behind still half full. That night, I barely slept. I lay there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep allowing her to trample over my self-worth, my dignity. I had two choices, either stay and let her continue to tear me down, or finally gather the courage to walk away, to reclaim whatever was left of the man I'd once been. The next morning, I didn't wait for her to wake up. I left the house before dawn, taking a long drive to clear my head. I thought about everything, our years together, the good times, the laughter, the promises we'd made. But those memories felt hollow now, tainted by the betrayal that had replaced them. By the time I returned, a decision had formed in my mind. I wasn't going to let her control me anymore. I wasn't going to be her punching bag, her convenient scapegoat, her toy to break and discard. It was time to reclaim my life, to take back whatever dignity I still had left. When I walked through the door, she was already up, sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning her phone with that same disinterested expression. She didn't even look up as I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was as though I were nothing more than a shadow, an inconvenience in her carefully curated world. I took a deep breath, the words heavy but steady. Marie, we need to talk. She glanced up, her eyes narrowing with mild annoyance. What now, Dave? I'm done, I said, each word carrying the weight of everything she'd put me through. I'm done with this marriage. I'm done being the one you mock, the one you disrespect. You want out? Fine. I'm giving you exactly what you asked for. Her face flickered with surprise for the briefest second, a crack in her icy facade. But then, she recovered, shrugging nonchalantly. If that's what you want, she said coolly, turning back to her phone. Makes no difference to me. But I saw it. The slightest tremor in her hand, the way her jaw clenched just a bit tighter. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to finally stand up to her. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. I turned, heading up the stairs to start packing, each step a declaration, a reclamation of the man she'd tried so hard to destroy. And as I reached the top, I knew, whatever came next, I was ready for it. I was finally done being her victim. Packing up my things was a strange, almost surreal experience. I walked through the bedroom that we'd once shared, every item reminding me of some small piece of a life that now felt like someone else's. The pictures on the dresser, the clothes in the closet, all seemed to belong to a stranger. And I realized, with a clarity that cut through my anger, that the life I thought we'd built together had been nothing more than a lie. I could hear Marie downstairs, pacing back and forth, her voice hushed as she spoke on the phone. I didn't know who she was talking to, but I could tell from her tone that she was bothered, her composure cracked. For the first time, she sounded unsure. Maybe it was the realization that her game had come to an end, or maybe it was the sudden awareness that she'd finally pushed me too far. Whatever it was too little, too late. I threw a few more essentials into a duffel bag, taking only what I knew I'd need. The rest of it could stay behind. I didn't want any reminders of the years I'd wasted on her. As I zipped up the bag, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, and I barely recognized the man staring back at me. There was something new in my eyes, a hardness, a determination that hadn't been there before. I headed downstairs, my steps heavy but steady. Marie was off the phone by then, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, her gaze unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us thick and tense. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me, but I knew there was nothing left to say. "So that's it, then?" she finally asked, her voice laced with something between anger and disbelief. "That's it," I replied, keeping my tone calm, controlled. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure again. "You got what you wanted, Marie. You wanted out, and now you have it." She scoffed, shaking her head, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Don't try to make this out like I'm the bad guy, Dave. You were the one who let things get boring. You were the one who stopped trying." Her words stung, but I'd heard them all before. The blame shifting, the excuses, it was the same tired routine she'd used to justify her actions from the start. But this time, I wasn't going to let it get to me. "Maybe you're right," I said, surprising even myself. "Maybe I did let things get boring. But that doesn't excuse what you did. It doesn't excuse the lying, the betrayal, the way you treated me like I was nothing. You had a choice, Marie, and you chose to throw it all away." She rolled her eyes, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty there. She was losing control of the narrative, and it was clear she didn't know how to handle it. "Fine," she said, her voice dripping with indifference. "If that's how you want it, then go. No one's stopping you." I took one last look at her, the woman I'd once thought was my partner, my confidant. I could hardly believe how far we'd fallen, how quickly everything had unraveled. But there was a part of me, a deep, hidden part, that felt relief. I was finally free of her games, her lies, her twisted manipulation. Without another word, I walked to the door, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back. But I didn't look back. Not this time. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold, fresh air, the first taste of freedom I'd had in years. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life from the ground up. It wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her laughter, felt the sting of her betrayal all over again. But each day, the memories grew a little dimmer, and I began to feel like myself again, like the man I'd been before Marie's bitterness had eroded my spirit. I rented a small apartment across town, modest but enough to call my own. The first night there, as I stood in the empty living room, I felt an overwhelming wave of emotions, a strange blend of sadness, anger, and a tentative sense of peace. I was starting over, and for the first time in a long time, I was in control. It wasn't long before I started noticing changes in myself. I began reaching out to old friends, people I'd lost touch with over the years. It was surprising, but also heartening, to find that they hadn't forgotten me, that they were there, ready to help me pick up the pieces. Slowly, I began to rebuild a sense of community, a support system that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. One evening, a friend of mine, Kevin, invited me out to a small gathering. It was just a casual get-together, a chance to relax and let go. And for the first time in months, I felt a spark of excitement. I put on a decent shirt, brushed off the dust of the past, and stepped out into the world again. As the night went on, I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in what felt like ages. It was strange, feeling happiness that wasn't tied to anyone else, that wasn't dependent on someone's approval or affection. It was just me, my own happiness, my own freedom. And in that moment, I knew I was going to be okay. Marie tried to reach out a few times, sending me messages that ranged from indifferent to accusatory. She'd swing from, "I hope you're doing well," to, "I don't understand why you're still so bitter." It was as if she couldn't decide whether she wanted to pretend we were still friends or cut me down one last time. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The chapter was closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. One day, I got a call from Mark. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. He sounded tense, like he was barely holding it together, and the satisfaction I felt was undeniable. Marie, he said, had left him, too. She'd moved on to someone else, apparently just as bored with him as she'd been with me. "You knew what you were getting into, Mark," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady. "Maybe next time, don't mess around with someone else's wife." He stammered, tried to apologize, but I didn't have time for him. I ended the call, feeling lighter than I had in years. It wasn't about revenge, but there was a certain justice in knowing that she'd shown her true colors to someone else, that her charm and cruelty would eventually catch up with her. And as I put down the phone, a sense of closure settled over me. I was done. Done with the pain, done with the bitterness, done with the person who dragged me down to her level. For the first time, I felt ready to move forward, to let go of the anger and embrace the life that was waiting for me, a life on my terms, free from the lies and betrayal. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was looking forward to finding out. In the end, Marie had taught me something valuable, even if she hadn't meant to. She'd shown me the importance of self-respect, of not settling for a life that wasn't worthy of who I was. And as I looked out at the city lights, I knew I'd never make that mistake again. With the weight of Marie's betrayal finally lifting, I began to feel like I was stepping out of a long, dark tunnel. My days took on a quiet simplicity, filled with small routines that I hadn't had the time to enjoy in years. I'd wake up early, take long morning walks through the neighborhood, feeling the crisp air hit my face, a reminder that I was free. I decided to take some time off from work to focus on myself, a luxury I hadn't allowed myself in years. I'd been so wrapped up in making a life with Marie, in proving myself to her, that I'd forgotten to listen to my own needs. I went back to the hobbies I'd abandoned over the years, things I once loved but had let go of in the name of growing up. I dusted off my old camera, rediscovering my love for photography, capturing small moments of beauty that felt like pieces of my own healing. The freedom felt good, even though the scars of betrayal still lingered beneath the surface. But each day, they faded a little more, becoming less a source of pain and more a reminder of what I'd overcome. One evening, I decided to check out a small cafe that had recently opened nearby. I walked in, inhaling the scent of fresh coffee, the warmth of the space immediately comforting. As I waited in line, I noticed a woman sitting by the window, engrossed in a book, her face relaxed and peaceful. Something about her caught my eye, not in a romantic way, but in a way that felt grounding, reassuring. She looked at peace, like she'd found her own little pocket of calm, and I realized that's exactly what I wanted for myself. The thought lingered with me as I ordered my coffee and sat down. Watching her, I felt an odd sense of encouragement, a reminder that life didn't have to be complicated, that peace was possible. Maybe one day, I'd be ready to open up to someone new, to trust again. But for now, I was content to sit in that cafe, enjoy my coffee, and let myself exist without the pressure of someone else's expectations. As the weeks turned into months, I settled into a life that felt distinctly my own. I started going to therapy, something I'd never done before, and it felt like peeling back layers I'd long since buried. I began to understand the parts of me that had allowed Marie to treat me the way she had, the part that had convinced me to stay when I should have left. It was a slow, often painful process, but with each session, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control of my own story. One day, during a session, my therapist asked me a question that stuck with me: "What are you afraid of, Dave?" I paused, the question ringing in my mind, echoing in a way that felt almost haunting. Fear. It was strange, I hadn't thought of myself as afraid, at least not consciously. But as I sat there, the truth settled over me. I'd been afraid of losing the life I thought I needed, afraid of being alone, afraid that if I let Marie go, I'd be left with nothing. The realization felt like a release, like I was finally letting go of a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. I'd spent so much of my life clinging to things that didn't serve me, so much time fearing a future that hadn't yet come. But now, for the first time, I was ready to face it, ready to let go of the fear and step into something unknown. As spring turned to summer, I received a message from an old friend, Emily, who I hadn't seen in years. She was coming into town and wanted to catch up. Emily had been a good friend back in college, someone I could always rely on, and her message felt like a gift from the universe. We agreed to meet at the same cafe I'd been frequenting, a place that now felt like a second home. When she walked in, I barely recognized her, but her smile was the same warm, genuine smile I remembered. We spent hours talking, reminiscing about old times, catching up on each other's lives. She told me about her work, her travels, her family, and in turn, I shared bits and pieces of my story, the parts one felt comfortable revealing. At one point, she looked at me, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, Dave?" I nodded, the familiar sting of old wounds flickering in my chest, but this time it was bearable, like a bruise that was finally starting to heal. "Yeah," I admitted, "but I'm learning to move on." We talked about life, about growth, about the resilience it took to rebuild after something so devastating. Emily didn't pry, didn't ask for details I wasn't ready to share. Instead, she listened, offering a quiet support that felt like a balm on my soul. And as the night wore on, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was something better waiting for me. As we said our goodbyes, she hugged me tightly, and I felt the warmth of genuine connection, the kind that I'd lost over the years. "Take care of yourself, Dave," she whispered, pulling back with a smile. "You deserve to be happy." Her words lingered with me as I walked home, echoing in my mind like a quiet promise. Happiness. It was a strange concept, something I hadn't allowed myself to consider in a long time. But now, it felt possible, like a door that was finally creaking open, revealing glimpses of something new. In the months that followed, I began to build a life that felt whole, independent of anyone else's influence or approval. I threw myself into work, finding satisfaction in my accomplishments, no longer motivated by a need to prove myself to anyone but me. I reconnected with old friends, forming a support network that reminded me of the value of true companionship. And I kept in touch with Emily, our occasional texts and coffee meetups a quiet reassurance that life, no matter how broken, could be mended. Marie occasionally drifted back into my mind, but her presence felt muted, like a shadow that had lost its power over me. I no longer felt the anger, the bitterness, the need to understand her choices. She was a part of my past, but she no longer held sway over my present. I was free of her, free of the hurt, and finally free to live life on my own terms. One evening, as I stood by the window, watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the city, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I'd come a long way, further than I'd ever thought possible. The wounds were still there, but they were healing, transforming into scars that told a story of resilience, of survival, of a man who had faced his deepest fears and come out the other side. And in that quiet moment, I realized something profound. I didn't need Marie, or anyone else, to feel whole. I was enough, just as I was, and for the first time in my life, I was proud of the man I'd become. In the months that followed, I found myself savoring a peace that had once felt unattainable. Life, in its simplicity, became my anchor. I was no longer rushing to meet someone else's expectations, no longer tied to the nagging feeling that I wasn't enough. Instead, I was finding contentment in everyday moments, cooking a meal from scratch, reading a novel late into the night, or taking weekend trips to explore nearby trails and beaches. Emily and I stayed in touch, our friendship becoming a steady presence in my life. She had a way of understanding me that felt effortless, a refreshing contrast to the emotional minefield I'd survived with Marie. Our coffee meetups turned into hikes, then into dinner outings. There was never any pressure, no expectation that our connection needed to be anything but what it was, a friendship that grew deeper with each encounter. One evening, after a day spent hiking along a scenic trail, we sat at a small hilltop overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting a soft, warm glow over everything, and the sight was so breathtaking, it made my chest ache. "You've come a long way, you know," Emily said, her voice quiet but filled with warmth. I looked over at her, meeting her gentle smile, and for a moment, the weight of everything I'd been through felt like it was finally lifting. "I think I'm finally figuring out who I am," I admitted, the words feeling strangely liberating. She nodded, her gaze steady. "It shows. You look free." We sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink. For the first time in a long time, I felt fully present, unburdened by the past, unafraid of the future. It was just me, here, in this moment, at peace. Not long after that day, I received a message that nearly reopened the wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. It was from Marie. She wanted to meet up. Part of me recoiled at the thought, the old anger and bitterness bubbling up as memories of her betrayal flashed through my mind. But another part of me, a calmer, wiser part, knew that this was something I needed to face. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, not the one I frequented with Emily, but a different one, a place that held no emotional ties. When I walked in, I saw Marie sitting at a corner table, her face drawn and weary. She looked different, older somehow, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up with her. "Dave," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, almost hesitant. "Thank you for meeting me." I sat down, offering a polite nod, but I kept my distance emotionally. I wasn't here for her, I was here for me, to close this chapter once and for all. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, the one she'd so callously disregarded before, around her finger. I wanted to apologize," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "For everything. I know I hurt you, and I know there's nothing I can say to change that. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." The words felt strange, surreal, as if they were coming from a different person. For a long time, I'd dreamed of hearing her apologize, of seeing some semblance of remorse. But now, sitting across from her, the words didn't have the power I'd once thought they would. I took a deep breath, my voice steady. "I appreciate that, Marie. But we're past that now. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." She looked up, surprised by the calm in my voice, her eyes searching my face as if she didn't quite recognize the man sitting before her. "You seem different." "I am," I said simply, offering a faint smile. "I'm done holding on to the anger, the resentment. Life's too short to carry that weight. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say more, but she simply nodded, understanding in her eyes. I wish you happiness, Dave. You deserve it. I stood, feeling lighter than I ever had before. Take care, Marie. And with that, I walked out, leaving the past where it belonged, behind me. The final step in my journey was letting go of the old version of myself, the part that had been shaped by Marie's expectations, by the need to be someone I wasn't. I took time to reflect on what I wanted in life, what truly mattered to me. I set new goals, not because I felt I had to prove anything, but because I genuinely wanted to grow. I decided to take a leap and apply for a photography exhibit, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. To my surprise, I got accepted. The night of the exhibit, I stood among my own work, surrounded by people who appreciated the beauty I'd captured. It was a surreal feeling, one of pride and accomplishment, and for the first time, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction in my own abilities. Emily was there, too, her smile beaming as she admired the photographs. She had been my support through it all, a quiet presence that reminded me of my own worth. As the night went on, we found ourselves talking, laughing, a natural ease settling between us. And then, as we were standing in front of one of my favorite photographs, a quiet landscape of a solitary tree at dawn, she looked at me, her eyes filled with something new, something that made my heart skip a beat. Dave, she said softly, her voice filled with a warmth that felt like home, you're not just a friend to me. Her words lingered in the air, carrying a depth that went beyond anything I'd expected. And in that moment, I realized I felt the same. My heart, bruised and battered, was finally ready to open again, ready to trust, to love. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I grew closer, our connection blossoming into something neither of us had anticipated but both of us embraced wholeheartedly. Our relationship was grounded in honesty, respect, and a mutual understanding that came from years of friendship and shared experiences. Being with her felt natural, effortless. She didn't demand anything from me, didn't try to mold me into someone I wasn't. With Emily, I was free to be myself, free to grow, to heal, and to love without fear. She accepted me, scars and all, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. One evening, as we watched the sunset from the same hill where we'd once shared a quiet moment, she took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude that mirrored my own. For what? I asked, my heart full. For being you, she replied, a gentle smile spreading across her face. For letting me in. In that moment, I knew I'd found what I'd been searching for all along, not in someone else, but in myself. The strength to move forward, the courage to open up, and the knowledge that love, when rooted in respect and understanding, could truly heal. I leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, feeling a warmth that went beyond words. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew that the pain, the betrayal, all of it had led me to this moment, a new beginning, a love born from resilience, and a future that was finally my own. Life had come full circle, and I was ready, more than ever, to embrace whatever came next. As the months turned into a year, Emily and I settled into a quiet rhythm together, one marked by simplicity and mutual respect. Life with her felt like stepping into warm sunlight after a long, relentless winter. Our days were filled with laughter, long conversations, and a genuine appreciation for each other's presence. She became more than a partner, she became my anchor, the steady reassurance that love didn't have to hurt to be real. One evening, while we were cooking dinner in my small kitchen, she looked at me with a playful glint in her eyes. You know, she teased, handing me a spoon to taste the sauce, I used to think I'd never find someone who could make me feel as safe as I do with you. I tasted the sauce, smiling as I nodded in approval. Is that right? She nodded, her gaze softening as she set down the spoon. With you, it feels like home. Like everything I went through was leading me here. Her words struck a chord deep within me. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close as I whispered, "I know exactly what you mean." For so long, I'd believed that love was complicated, painful, a sacrifice of self. But with Emily, I'd found a kind of love that was restorative, a love that built me up rather than tore me down. As time passed, we began talking about the future, about building a life together that was rooted in the shared values we both held dear. Emily was supportive, kind, and honest, qualities that felt like a balm after the chaos of my past. She encouraged me to continue my photography, even going so far as to help me launch a small online shop where I could share my work with a wider audience. Her belief in me, in my art, was something I hadn't experienced before, and it made me want to become the best version of myself. One autumn morning, as the leaves turned golden and the air held that crispness that signaled change, I asked her to marry me. It wasn't a grand proposal, no elaborate gestures or planned speeches. We were sitting by a lake after a long hike, our fingers intertwined, watching the reflection of the trees dance on the water's surface. I turned to her, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but soft, "will you marry me?" Her face lit up with a mixture of joy and surprise, her eyes filling with tears. She nodded, her hand trembling as she reached up to touch my face. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "1,000 times, yes." We shared a quiet, heartfelt embrace, a moment that felt like it belonged to just us, surrounded by the peaceful solitude of nature. There were no witnesses, no distractions, just two people, deeply in love, making a promise to face life's ups and downs together. The wedding was simple, intimate, and filled with the people who had stood by us through the twists and turns of life. My family, old friends, and even some colleagues came, their warm smiles and congratulations a reminder of the support that had carried me through my darkest days. Kevin, my friend from college, was my best man, and he couldn't help but poke fun at how far I'd come. "Dave," he said during his toast, raising his glass with a grin, "we all know what you've been through. And to see you here, genuinely happy, surrounded by people who love you, well, it's proof that life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it?" The laughter and clinking of glasses filled the room, and I looked over at Emily, my heart swelling with gratitude. She had shown me that love didn't have to be a battle, that it could be a partnership built on trust, understanding, and compassion. When we shared our first dance, I whispered to her, "Thank you for finding me." She laughed, her eyes sparkling as she replied, "No, thank you for letting me in." Our life together blossomed in the way that things do when they're tended with care and respect. We bought a small house on the edge of town, a place with just enough room for a studio where I could work on my photography and a garden for Emily to indulge her love of plants. The house became a haven, a place of comfort and growth, and every corner held a piece of our story. Emily and I talked about everything, our pasts, our dreams, our fears, and in those conversations, I found a healing that went beyond words. We were honest about our insecurities, our uncertainties, and in sharing those vulnerabilities, we grew closer. Occasionally, thoughts of Marie would surface, lingering like shadows, but they no longer held any power over me. The memories of betrayal had dulled, faded into the background of a life that was now full of love and peace. I could think of her without bitterness, without anger. She was simply part of a journey that had led me to Emily, to a life that felt more authentic, more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined. One summer afternoon, as I was framing a new series of photographs in my studio, Emily walked in, her face glowing with excitement. She held up a small white stick, her hands shaking with happiness and disbelief. "Dave," she whispered, her voice filled with awe, "we're going to be parents." The world stopped for a moment, and I felt an overwhelming rush of emotions, joy, fear, gratitude, and a love so deep it was almost painful. I wrapped my arms around her, the enormity of the moment settling over us as we stood there, holding each other in a quiet, sacred embrace. The months that followed were filled with anticipation and preparation. We decorated a nursery, choosing colors and patterns that felt warm and inviting. I took countless photos of Emily, capturing her glowing smile and the gentle way she held her growing belly, each image a testament to the beauty of new beginnings. When our daughter, Grace, was born, I felt like I was seeing the world anew. Holding her tiny hand, watching her sleepy smile, I understood what it meant to truly love without condition, without fear. She was a part of me, a part of Emily, a part of the life we'd built together. As Grace grew, so did my understanding of what it meant to forgive, to let go of the past, to move forward with an open heart. Emily and I continued to build a life that was rich in simplicity, in moments that didn't need embellishment. Our home was filled with laughter, with quiet conversations, with the sound of Grace's laughter echoing through the rooms. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching Grace play in the yard, Emily took my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice soft but sure. I looked at her, at our daughter, at the life we'd created, and for the first time, the answer felt as natural as breathing. "Yes," I said, smiling as I looked at the family that had filled my heart. More than I ever thought possible. We sat there in silence, the fading light of the day casting a warm glow over us, a sense of peace settling into every fiber of my being. My journey had been filled with heartache, with betrayal, with moments of doubt. But in the end, I'd found something far greater than I'd ever imagined, a love that was pure, a life that was whole, and a happiness that was entirely my own. As I watched the sunset with my wife and daughter by my side, I knew I'd finally come home. As the years passed, life fell into a beautiful, steady rhythm, each day anchored by love and purpose. Grace grew into a bright, curious little girl who filled our home with laughter, her energy and innocence a daily reminder of how far I'd come. Emily and I thrived together, our bond deepening as we faced the joys and challenges of raising a family. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing unexpected turns even when everything seems perfectly in place. One crisp autumn morning, I received an email from an unfamiliar name that made my heart skip, a request from Marie to meet. I hadn't thought about her in years, she had faded into a part of my past I rarely revisited. But curiosity and a lingering sense of closure prompted me to respond. We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown, where our story had once taken a dark turn. When I arrived, I barely recognized the woman who sat across from me. Marie looked worn, her confident demeanor now replaced with a subdued fragility. She met my gaze with eyes that held an apology before she even spoke. "Dave," she began, her voice soft, almost vulnerable, "thank you for meeting me." I nodded, waiting for her to continue, aware of how calm I felt. The years had transformed me, the wounds of our past were now scars that no longer stung. She took a shaky breath. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you something I couldn't keep inside anymore. I lost a lot after we parted, more than I expected. And in all that, I realized that what I did to you was the worst thing I've ever done. I wanted you to know. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." Her words hung in the air, raw and remorseful, and I felt a surprising wave of empathy for the woman I'd once loved and lost. I thought of the path she had chosen, the emptiness I'd seen in her life, and in that moment, I realized I'd finally forgiven her, not for her, but for myself. "Marie," I said gently, "I forgive you. And I hope you can forgive yourself. We both went through our own battles, and I think we've both changed." I smiled, a genuine, small smile, one that came from a place of peace. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears, but her face held a hint of relief. She reached across the table, a gesture of both closure and respect. I took her hand briefly, knowing that this was the final chapter, the last piece of unfinished business. After she left, I sat in the cafe, letting the past settle and dissolve into the background. My heart felt lighter, as if a long-buried weight had finally been lifted. I took out my phone and sent Emily a simple message, "I'll be home soon." Love you. Later that evening, as Emily and I tucked Grace into bed, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. Life, with all its unexpected twists, had led me to this moment, a moment of peace, of redemption, of true happiness. Emily noticed my thoughtful expression and reached for my hand. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes warm with concern. I looked at her, the woman who had taught me the true meaning of love, and nodded. "More than okay," I said, smiling. "I'm just grateful." As we walked downstairs, the house quiet, I pulled Emily close, wrapping my arms around her as we stood in the soft glow of our home. I kissed her gently, a kiss filled with everything I'd been through, everything we'd built, and everything that lay ahead. Sometimes, life takes us down paths we never expected, paths filled with pain, betrayal, and moments that test the very core of who we are. But through it all, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know existed. And in the end, those pieces form a life richer and more meaningful than anything we could have ever planned. As I held Emily close, I knew that every step, every scar, every broken promise had led me here. And for the first time, I felt not just at peace but complete, whole in a way I never thought possible. The past no longer held me. The future no longer scared me. I was finally, fully home.